Okay, hi, my name's Andy, head trainer and managing director of Able Training Support Limited, and we're putting together a bit of a special vlog or presentation today around the subject of understanding force. So this is understanding the use of reasonable force and looking at the principles of physical intervention within a variety of different settings, whether those settings be education or health and social care or even commercial settings, anywhere really. This may be useful or informative for anybody who may have to deal with unpredictable or aggressive behaviour, personal safety, or obviously understanding the uses of force and what they are and aren't allowed to do regarding their workplace. So hopefully there'll be some bits in here that'll be useful. We're going to be looking at some true and false principles. There are lots of ideas and false ideas that we've come across over the years of delivering this course on courses around the subjects of reasonable force, and also just looking at some of the terminology of that. So we'll jump straight into it and let's see how we go. Okay, so first off, I thought we'd do a little bit of a definition as far as what do we mean by this term physical intervention. One of the things, there's a lot of people who don't realise the scope of what's included within physical intervention. So if we take the definition there, and this is my preferred definition, there is a number of different ones out there. And this is a bit of an amalgamation of a few taken from like Skills for Security, but also the Challenging Behaviour Foundation. So the use of direct or indirect force, bodily, mechanical or environmental, to affect a person's movement or behaviour. Okay, so let's take each line individually. So what do you mean by direct or indirect force? Now, as far as direct force is concerned, if I was to hold you to stop you from leaving a room, I'm applying direct force to affect your movement and behaviour. So that would mean by direct. I'm applying some level of force to you. Indirect force might be blocking your path. So I'm still using some level of bodily force to affect your movement and behaviour. If I'm stopping you from leaving a room or stopping you getting to another person or getting an object, I'm still limiting and affecting your movement and behaviour, but I'm not actually making any physical contact. So that's what we class as an indirect use of physical force. Now, when we're referring to bodily, mechanical, or environmental, so bodily, there's lots of different terms, but manual restraint is another example of that, or manual force, or physical force, is where I'm using my body to apply that force. Okay, mechanical could be anything from handcuffs or belts or straps or anything along those lines. So some level of mechanical device. Okay? And then we've got environmental, which is something about the environmental, like blocking your path using furniture or locking or blocking a door will also be included in that. So the scope of this is quite significant. If we take that, anything affects a person's movement and behaviour. So for instance, let's say we jumped into a pool and saved a person from drowning. We have technically physically intervened. We have used direct force to prevent them from drowning, affected their movement and behaviour. So physical intervention doesn't have to be used or refer to anything kind of use of inappropriate force or doing it purposely to kind of stop or inhibit something bad. It could be to save a life. Even things like first aid would be classed as physical intervention. Changing a child's nappy is physical intervention. Supporting a person with their eating could be classed as physical intervention. The scope is quite significant. If you take an example of an environmental factor, for instance, even turning off lights on somebody. We know somebody was scared of the dark, and we know that turning the landing light off may affect their movement and behaviour. Therefore, we've affected the environment to impact on their movement and behaviour, and that would be classed as physical intervention. Okay, now you'll see the two words there on the presentation, the restrictive and non-restrictive. And one of the things I always try and get over on my courses is making sure people are aware of the spectrum that we refer to with physical intervention of what is restrictive and what is non-restrictive. So non-restrictive, all physical interventions have a restrictive aspect to them. So maybe it's a falsehood referring to it as non-restrictive. Because even let's say we had a breakaway technique, for instance, or even let's say a defense from strikes. If I'm putting my hands up to protect my face, I am affecting a person's movement and behaviour. So I am restricting their movement or restricting their ability to do something. However, they can go everywhere else in the world other than hitting me in the face. So we would class that as non-restrictive. The same as a breakaway technique. You grab me, I disengage from it and move away. I have affected your movement and behaviour using direct force. However, you can go wherever you like again. There's no further restriction on your movement. So when we refer to non-restrictive, we don't mean there is an aspect of restrictive to it. It means it is a minimal level of restriction. Okay. Um, so there's lots of things in my view. So turning a life off somebody would be classed as potentially non-restrictive. A really good example I use to help people to understand is using the example of a seatbelt. So a seatbelt is a physical intervention. Okay, every vehicle has them. It's mandatory that we wear the seatbelts. But a seatbelt is usually classed as a non-restrictive intervention in the fact that it only really inhibits your movement at that moment of impact, and most people can take the seatbelt off. So you move your arms and legs, move body, but at that moment of impact, it stops you. So it has a restrictive aspect to it. And what I try and get over though is what may be restrictive to one person may not be restrictive to another. So a seatbelt class as non-restrictive. However, in the event of a crash, a seatbelt can become restrictive if it becomes damaged or broken, or the pressure that's pulled on it, or anything like that. And that's why many people carry seatbelt cutters, because it can become restrictive. I also use the example that when my gran was deteriorating with certain forms of dementia, there was a period I was in the car with her and she forgot how to work a seatbelt. She couldn't figure it out. So straight away, if I'd left her in the car with a seatbelt on, she would have actually been restrained. Okay, it would have been classed as restrictive for her. Okay, even though technically it's classed as a non-restrictive intervention. So again, this is not a fixed thing. It is a grey area, it's a spectrum. So on the other end, now if we look at the justification, and we'll look at reasonable force in a little bit. Justification of using a seatbelt is the fact that it saves lives. However, a seatbelt still carries risk of harm, and we'll refer to that back to that a little bit later. But some people, a seatbelt is not a safe way of keeping them safe in a vehicle. Some individuals have to be harnessed into a vehicle like a toddler. Okay, so when I hear people say, I've never restrained or I wouldn't restrain, any parent has definitely restrained. If you've got cot sides on your cot, that's a restraint. If you've got a stair gate, it's a restraint. If you held a child's hand while you're walking through the supermarket, that is restraint. You're affecting them in behaviour using direct force. And I would say that's towards the restrictive end of a physical intervention rather than non-restrictive. Okay, so a harness is classed as restrictive. Now, we might be able to justify that use based on the person's vulnerability and risk, and we'll look at that as far as we go through the process. Right, there's a number of different terms out there. When I first started exploring and understanding this subject, I heard lots of different terminology, and we get lots of customers asking for different terms and things like that. So there's a few things just to raise your awareness of. First off, positive handling is a term that's often used in education settings. It's why classed as a fluffy term. I completely understand its use. It takes some of the stigmatization away from that terminology of restraint that people don't like. I understand teachers wanting to refer to that we had to positively handle the child, and it's trying to put it into that context of we only use it as a positive thing, as a safety measure. So I get the mentality. The only thing I want people to understand is that if I positively handle a person against their will and consent, that is still a physical intervention. And if it's to prevent their movement, then it's a restriction. The same as safe holding. We used to get lots of people who go, well, we don't do restraint, no restraint policy, but sometimes the staff have to safely hold an individual to stop them from hurting themselves. Well, that's fine. It's a lovely fluffy term. It sounds lovely, but it is still technically a restraint. Now, some places do use the term safe hold slightly differently. So they might refer to, let's say, if I'm just supporting my hand over an arm to stop a person from hitting out, that's a safe hold, whereas gripping the wrist might be a restraint. So some places do kind of use that terminology to indicate a different level of restriction. Okay, but as long as they know if we're restricting a person's movement against their will and consent, that is still restraint. Another term I have heard a few places, most people have heard of safeguarding, usually associated with obviously protecting a person from abuse, neglect, or all of the variety of kind of vulnerabilities for vulnerable adults and children. But I've also heard safeguarding, two separate words used to indicate some form of physical intervention. We were safely guarding them from hurting themselves or from hurting others. Okay, so again, it's just another term that you might come across. Another one, therapeutic holding. Now, therapeutic holding sometimes is classed as different again, sometimes it's a case of we're doing it for their own good. That's the idea. There is some situations, let's say if you have a baby who has become extremely distressed, how would a caregiver naturally help that baby? By holding it close, letting it feel the calm heartbeat, letting it feel the rhythm of our breathing, and using this external source of a primary caregiver to regulate. And there are some individuals that do, in early stages, need an external source of some level of therapeutic kind of holding, where we're not using it really as a restraint. We're more using it a bit like we'd hold a child to kind of help them to regulate, help them to calm. We maintain that calm through the process. It's something that is, again, there's controversy around it. I always try and discourage people from using it as a go-to as far as therapeutic holding. Some individuals it can work, but you've got to remember a case of we want to be trying to move them away from anything like that. It still wants to be, there should be written a care plan about how we're going to kind of reduce the need for this, because there may be a point where this individual is too big for them to be held and supported, and it becomes a danger to them or to the people doing the holding themselves. So although it may be a short-term strategy, I would still always look to move away from it. The last couple there, MVA and PMVA. We get loads and loads of inquiries looking for PMVA training. It's one of the things that through a few organisations used it as a term for their training, and the NHS tend to use it quite often as a term around, especially agency staff. Often we get them contacting and wanting PMVA training. There is nothing wrong with referring to the term PMVA or MVA, or there's another TMVA was another one, therapeutic managing of violence and aggression. There's loads of different terminologies out there. Please don't get caught up in the terminology. You are looking for training in physical intervention, whether that be non-restrictive, like personal safety, defense from strikes or breakaway techniques, or restrictive, where we're going into the guiding and safe holding or restraint techniques. Okay. Anything other than that, you want to know the threshold of physical intervention that you are learning based on the risk assessment of your environment. There's also loads of brand names out there as well. Obviously, Able Training, we are an organisation. Our Able Target System is our brand name. That is our Coke, whereas you might have other organisations out there that are Pepsi. Okay, it doesn't mean one's necessarily better than the other. They're just different, and we all have our preferences and a reason why we do things the way we do. When exploring an appropriate training provider, make sure that they meet the values that you require as an organisation, that you ensure you're doing some level of training needs analysis, so your staff are only being taught what they should be doing. And I also highly recommend that you go to an organisation with some level of accreditation or recognition of their training, whether that be through the British Institute of Learning Disability, so Build Act, as far as meeting the Restraint Reduction Network, which is currently mandatory in the NHS and semi-mandatory. I won't go into this on this as far as CQC registered organisations are concerned. Or you've got the Institute of Conflict Management that also offer an accreditation scheme. There is a couple of others out there as well, but they're the two that our courses are accredited and recognised by. Okay, all we're looking for, or what we would recommend there, is you're going for a course that has some level of recognition, that has been quality checked by an external agency. There are situations where you might get individuals who've done things like door supervisor training, that then they would come into care. Now, to be fair, a lot of the techniques are very similar. There's a big thing in going, oh, well, is that for doorman or is that for care? Well, what actually happened is the techniques that were given to doormen by the SIA were taken from care. They are still very low level and low risk, as far as there's good and bad techniques out there, but there is a lot of similarities. There are only so many ways to hold people's arms and legs. Okay, what I would recommend though is you are making sure that the organisation's techniques are risk assessed, externally risk assessed ideally, but both psychologically and physically, depending if you're working with vulnerable individuals. So you're looking at some level of risk assessment. So all our techniques have been medically risk assessed by a physiotherapist, psychologically risk assessed by a clinical psychologist, and we've also had people with lived experience who've actually been restrained come in and review our techniques. It's one of the minimum standards for anybody to meet the Restraint Reduction Network standards to have their techniques assessed by those three sets of people. Okay, so let's look at a definition for restraint. Restraint is taking place when the planned or unplanned conscious or unconscious actions of a person prevent an individual from doing what they wish to do, as a result places limits on their freedom, whether or not the person is acting in a resistive manner. Okay, again, let's go through this a little bit. Planned or unplanned. A locked door is a planned restraint usually. Window restrictors, planned restraint. We also might have a planned restraint where it is pre-written, risk assessed, where the staff are going in, having to hold for something like a medical intervention or something along those lines. Okay, that is a planned restraint. It's something that's pre-risk assessed. We're ready. We manage the risks as appropriately as possible. It's not always wrong. Locking a door is a restraint. We may have justification for it to stop people getting into a premises. We must have a justification to stop people leaving a premises. Okay, but even window restrictors, we're stopping a person from climbing out the window. We may be justified in our actions as far as we don't want them to fall to their death, or we want to minimise the risk, or we don't mind them leaving, but we don't want them jumping out the window. However, we must also consider, well, in the event of a fire, we have also affected their ability to exit the building. So again, it doesn't mean it's wrong, we just have to risk assess it. Unplanned would be something that happens in an emergency. Something occurs where we have to take immediate action to maintain the safety of the individual or others in the environment. Conscious or unconscious actions of a person means the person who's doing the restraining either knows they're doing it or not. Now, obviously, that may seem strange, but one of the things I've come across in many, particularly elderly care settings, are the worst for this, where sometimes staff don't realise that their actions have actually affected that person's movement and behaviour. Let's say removing a walking aid, or even something as simple as leaving a table in front of somebody, might actually affect their ability to get up out of the chair. Now, that could be unconscious, where the staff hadn't even realised, they didn't think about it. However, sometimes those same strategies are very conscious. Leave the table there, stops a wandering. And now that is an example of a conscious restraint that, unless it's justified in a risk assessment and care plan, would also be an illegal and abusive form of restraint. We would not have justification for it. It's unlawful imprisonment, essentially. Okay. One of the things that is worthwhile understanding as an organisation is if you believe any actions or situations may result in an individual being restrained. So, for example, I was working at home and he said, we do have these little tables that sometimes there is coffee and tea on, but we are wondering whether some of our clients would struggle to move those out of the way, and that could limit their ability to get up out their chair and to move around freely. Are you saying that we should not have them? I said, well, it's not a problem to have them, but the individuals who wouldn't be able to move those little tables, if there is no coffee on there, the staff should be aware of the risk assessment that those tables should be moved. Okay, that's all it means. It doesn't mean that you can't have them. It just needs to be the risk reduced to a reasonable level, like any risk assessment process is concerned. It's really important that your staff understand risk assessments. It's important that the management team understand risk assessments. And something along those lines, it's not about eliminating risk completely, it's about reducing it to a reasonable level. Because even, let's say, somebody in a recliner chair, for instance, who can't get out of the recliner chair because they can't work the buttons or have that core strength, they are technically restrained. Doesn't mean we can't have them in a recliner chair, but the staff should be aware, they should be checking regularly to see if that person wants to get out at any point. So the rest of that is fairly self-explanatory. The last line there is quite important though, whether or not the person is acting in a resistive manner. So this is quite important when it comes to things like Dole's orders, or as it's going to be the safeguarding liberty protection, that if we were to stop a person from leaving the premises or leaving their room, whether they are asking to or not, we should have an appropriate risk assessment and care plan in place. So even if you've got somebody who's bedbound, but it's a case of, well, what would we say if they wanted to go home? If we would stop them, then there should potentially be some level of kind of legal framework or outline so the staff know what if tomorrow they ask to leave. Okay. So let's make sure we're fairly familiar as far as reasonable force is concerned. So we're looking at reasonable force then. There's two key terms that we need to be aware of. So reasonable force under every law, and I'm not going to go through all the laws with human rights, with common law, criminal law, all the different kind of standards that are out there and guidance related to use of force within different settings. They use this term reasonable. It's not minimum, it's reasonable. One of the things I've come across a lot is people using terms like minimum force or least restrictive. Please bear in mind, if you're using the term minimum force, it's to achieve the desired result, or least restrictive to manage the risk. It's not least restrictive full stop, it's least restrictive to manage the risk. Okay? Least restrictive is always going to be step back, don't do anything. That's always a least restrictive, but that sometimes may not be appropriate to provide an appropriate duty of care. Okay, so necessary and proportionate. Was the actions necessary, as in last resort, or proportionate? So straight on to the next slide. So when we're looking at necessary, was the force used absolutely necessary? We had no other option. It was what we had to do to either keep that person safe or keep ourselves safe, or meet the legal justification. Was the force stopped when no longer necessary? So we didn't carry on doing it even though we didn't need to. Okay? Was there other means available? And did you try these first? So let's say we had a child who was about to go stepping into the road and there was a car coming. Now, was there other means available? We could try and get their attention. We could call them, try and get them to stop running into the road. And did we try those first? Well, if we did, then we should obviously put down. We tried to call them, but they didn't pay any attention, so we grabbed them. But if we didn't feel it was appropriate due to the level of risk, then we should put that down. I would have preferred to have shouted them to draw their attention, but due to the level of risk, I had to grab them immediately to prevent them from being harmed before I could then find out what the reason was for them stepping on the road or to protect them. Okay, so if we couldn't try, and that doesn't mean it's wrong. Same as I always try and put it across. If somebody grabs your wrist, your minimum force would be, "Can you let go, please?" But that doesn't mean if they're trying to hit you, you then have to ask them to let go first. You may have to do your breakaway straight away and then putting down. I would have preferred to ask them to let go, but due to level of risk, I had to immediately physically separate myself, prevent any further injury before I was able to talk it down. You're then very clearly justifying, I would have preferred to have done that, but that wasn't available to me. I had to take this action. It was necessary in that moment. And was the force stop when no longer necessary? If I stopped that child from running into the road and there was a car coming, but then there was no cars coming and I continued to hold, then it might say the actions were now unnecessary. Okay. The second part of this then is the proportionate. So proportionate, was the force used proportionate to the wrong that it was stopping or avoiding? Now this is a balance of probabilities of foreseeable risk, risk of versus risk of not. So what is the risk of not intervening? This is what are they doing that we feel we need to stop? And this could include numerous impact factors that involve you, them, or others. Now, what we refer to as impact factors are things that could affect that risk. So things like vulnerabilities, size, gender, weapons, multiple people, the environment itself could impact on that, as in busy road, in a car, whatever it was. There's a risk of what are they doing that we feel we need to stop. On the other side, we've got the risk of the intervention itself. What are we going to have to do to stop that or to avoid that potential risk? And again, there's going to be impact factors. So the impacts of them, their vulnerability, size, build, strength, previous trauma. So psychological, physical factors to them, as well as the environment itself. And we're weighing up that balance of probabilities. So in the example of seatbelt that I used earlier, what's the risk of not wearing a seatbelt? Well, flying through the windscreen and potentially being dead. But are there any risks to wearing a seatbelt? Well, we could actually increase risk of whiplash, or it could become restrictive in a crash, or it could damage the chest. But the risk of using a seatbelt is less than the risk of not using a seatbelt, and therefore we can justify it. However, if you've got somebody who's pregnant, well, suddenly then the impact factor of them being pregnant is on the risk of the intervention. And therefore we may be able to justify not wearing a seatbelt in a vehicle if a person is pregnant. Hopefully that makes sense. Obviously, I've only got a little while to kind of go through that. This was something we include an awful lot more in the training that we give on physical intervention. Okay, so the next bit we're going to go into is a little bit on true or false and look at a few different questions around the true or false factor. Okay, so our first true or false then. Injury must be the result of unlawful misapplication of force. So one of the things I've already mentioned as we've gone through this presentation is that When we're looking at reasonable force or we're looking at physical intervention, no technique is no risk. If you think about anything, if we're trying to affect a person's movement or behaviour in any way, there could be a risk of bruising, scratching, anything like that. As soon as we're coming into physical contact with somebody, there could be a potential risk of injury. As we said, any example, like even say changing a baby's nappy, could we accidentally scratch with a fingernail? Of course we could. There could be a risk of injury. We're looking to kind of reduce the risk to a reasonable level. And it's that proportionality of risk of versus risk of not. So I remember receiving some photographs and stuff from obviously a very distressed mother who found us on Facebook, I think, and just sent over that she sent some photos of her son, who had been involved in a restraint, as she'd kind of described it. Showing photographs, and I based straight away passed it on, going, look, this is a concern. Raise it with safeguarding through the appropriate channels. But she was trying to get me to say that it was wrong. There were some scratches on the boy's kind of chest and his arm, and also you could see some bruising and stuff, and it really didn't look very pleasant. And I could completely understand the mother's distress, but the context was not there. We don't know, or we can't answer a question whether that's right or wrong to have those injuries, because it all depends on what was he doing that they needed to stop or inhibit. If he was being a significant danger to himself or others, and he could have seriously hurt himself, or let's say, trying to jump out of a window, an example on a fourth floor of a building, and she'd go, well, look at those injuries to his shoulders. Well, what would you rather happen? Him fall to his death or jump out the window, or those injuries to occur? Obviously, we'd rather neither, completely understandably. We've got to look at it as kind of proportionality, and was it necessary to use that physical intervention? So we're going back to that reasonable force principle. I also, in that particular incident, she also asked me about a particular name of a technique. One of the things I try and get over that different companies use different names for similar techniques. So we may not be able to tell you, well, this is right, this is wrong, based on the naming of a technique. We'd need to actually see the technique in action. We'd need to see and then appropriately risk assess it. And it also depends on the individual themselves, their vulnerabilities and risk factors as well. Look at the next one then. So floor holds, including prone, are more dangerous than seated holds. So this is slight area of irritation for many people who are genuinely in the know. There is a misconception that all floor holds carry a much higher risk than any other position. They are considered frowned upon. There is certain guidance, not law, but guidance, which specifies that prone restraint should be avoided. One of the reasons that prone has a particularly bad reputation is because there is a potential risk. Also, if you look at prone statistically, prone position has the highest recorded death rate of any restraint. The thing is, it doesn't include all the other factors. It doesn't include the other bits and pieces related to the restraints that were involved. Prone, if we looked at supine and prone, supine being face up on the floor and prone being face down, statistically, when you look at the physiology and the risks related to the physiology for an individual related to breathing difficulties, they both carry a similar risk to each other, which is fairly negligible, really, in the grand scheme of things. However, prone is used an awful lot more. So if a technique is used more often, but it carries the same risk of another technique, it shouldn't be surprising when more injuries and deaths occur due to that technique. If something's used more often, it's going to have a higher rate of injury and death than something that's used less often. Okay, and this is the problem with the difference between causation and correlation. And so many people I come across where they're looking at statistics related to restraint, look at causation and correlation. I'll give you an example why that isn't true in a moment or doesn't work. So the most dangerous position when you're looking at actually impact on breathing is actually a seated hold, but a seated position with the person being leant forward, so their nose towards their knees, restricting the ability to breathe, the ability for the diaphragm to expand. So actually, prone is a fairly low risk position if done correctly with appropriate monitoring. Obviously, certain medical conditions could actually increase the risk. Prone is actually being used more often. One is one of the easiest ways to gain control of a risk quickly. It's much harder to fight out of prone. It's a safer hold for the person being held and the people holding them, because we can get under control quicker. Duration of time carry a much greater risk of injury than the nature of the hold itself. Okay? So prone is a good position. Also, most people when they fall tend to fall into prone rather than supine position. Other thing to sort of think about, if we're dealing with somebody related to trauma, which one do you think could be a better position? Do you think most people who are, let's say, sexually abused have been in a face up position or a face down position? So sometimes some individuals may react very differently depending on the position moved into. So therefore it should be person centered. If they can't cope with supine and we have to hold them for whatever reason, we should try and get them to prone position if that causes less distress. There is also some evidence coming out, especially around the COVID pandemic, that actually showed that um, respiration in a prone position for some individuals is actually more beneficial and advantageous and easier for them than in a supine position as well. So the jury's still out. The big thing is that the justification of the technique should be based on the reasonable force. These techniques, a prone position or a supine position, are not banned, they're not illegal. It's just a case that they are frowned upon. Okay, but the big thing, if a person's sat down, they should be leant backwards. They should have that diaphragm open. We shouldn't put pressure and hugging around the chest cavity and things like that. They are the positions that do carry the risk. So when we're talking about the causation correlation, if we look at this next slide for a second, so often I hear people going, well, prone causes more deaths. Again, because they're looking at just the number of deaths related to prone rather than as a percentage across all the different holds that are being done. And the other factors to be included as well, like staff training, monitoring, and things like that. Okay. So this is one of my favorite kind of fun facts, that when correlation is not causation. If we look at correlation and drowning rates in comparison to when Nicolas Cage has made movies, you notice a very similar correlation between the two. Okay? If you put them on a graph, you can see, so does Nicolas Cage movies increase the risk of drowning? And obviously the answer is definitely no, but just because they plot together on a graph doesn't mean they definitely cause. We don't know which direction they go in. We don't know, there may just be a coincidence there. There could be other things that are causing both. So there could be other concerns for the person as far as their behaviour is concerned, which means they're more likely to go into prone, and that also increases the likelihood of their death. So there are lots of things to consider. There is numerous studies out there that show quite contravening evidence or contravening information to what some organisations kind of output as far as the correct positions, safe positions. Okay? We do discourage all our learners. We try and encourage them to go into seated or standing positions, and sort of we have our module 4 covers the floor holds, and we only ever teach them as an absolute last resort when all options are unavailable. We wouldn't aim to take a person to a floor, but if it is the safest way of controlling the risk, or if the person goes to the floor and we need to continue to support that person because to control the risk, then we would say that action was potentially justified under reasonable force. Okay, true or false? Training staff in restraint increases the likelihood to be used. So one of an old customer of ours raised this as an issue, that they were going to stop their physical intervention training because they'd read a report or read some information that training staff in restraint increased the likelihood to be used. This is another prime example of the Nicolas Cage stroke drowning incident correlation. The correlation and causation are not the same thing. So a report stating that, I almost guarantee that not all information was included. One, training staff and restraint increase the likelihood of it being used. Okay, so if you look at one premises, or you look at all the premises, and those places that have had restraint seem to have higher rates of restraint. Okay, so therefore it must cause it. Well, why are they getting training restraint? Is it because that place is a higher risk, and therefore the increased likelihood of needing the restraint training is because of the higher risk of the setting? Again, it don't mean that one causes the other. There may just be a correlation between the two. One of the things that say I had one customer where they had two parts of their business, or they combined two businesses, and one had had restraint training but never had an incident restraint. The other side of the business had never had restraint training but also claimed they'd never had a restraint. So, so there's no point in us doing the restraint training because now my one argument would be when I train staff in restraint, I make sure they understand what restraint is, when it should be reported, when it should not be reported, as in what class as a restrictive, non-restrictive, so they know when it can be used, how it should be used, and what classes are restraint. Because sometimes staff don't realise that, I say, guiding a person away or grabbing them by the arm to pull them away from a situation should then be recorded a restraint. Now, I'm pretty confident that the group that got trained in restraint but never used it probably were less likely to have actually ever used restraint than the group that had never been trained in restraint and didn't use it. Because do they even know what a restraint is? Do they know what would be classed as a restraint? So at least I know the group that I trained were very understanding that restraint is an absolute last resort. It should be used when no other options are available. But at least they were definitely recording any incident they did have. Whereas the other, do they really know what it is? What should be classed as? What's wrong? What's wrong? And that's always a concern for me. I think there's a falsehood of that when you do first aid training as staff, it doesn't mean they walk out the room hoping somebody drops down in front of them so they have a chance to go with that CPR thing they've just learned. And if it is put across as right that restraint should only ever be used as a last resort, that it does carry risks both to the individual restraining and the individuals who are actually doing the restraining, both psychologically and physically, and spend the day trying to put them off, but also making sure they have all the key skills to demonstrate the physical intervention of that last resort, their positive behavioural support training, their conflict management training, their de-escalation training, whatever it is, have they got all those key skills? And if you really drill that in, really train it and teach restraint right, it does not increase the likelihood of restraint occurring, in my opinion. It means that if it is done, at least it's done safely. Okay, I compare it in a very similar way to fire extinguishers. Not training your staff how to use the fire extinguishers, or sorry, let's turn it around. Training staff to use fire extinguishers doesn't mean they're more likely to let a fire occur. It just means if they do, they know how to manage it safely. They're trained to use the equipment as they should. Okay. So, next one. Settings should have a no touch or no restraint policies. So, as far as no touch, no restraint, one of the things the Department of Education came out and says is that schools should not have a no touch policy. The same as no restraint policies. I do and I don't agree. No touch, I don't agree with. You know, we've just at the beginning of this session, we looked at physical intervention could be, you know, holding a child's hand or giving somebody a hug or providing first aid. So how are you going to give first aid to a child if you've got a no touch policy? The no restraint policy, okay, restraint should always be used as an absolute last resort. Completely agree with that. But what are you going to do if a child's about to jump out the window? If the policy is no restraint, well then straight away that staff member who grabs that child to stop them from hurting themselves, or let's say to break up a fight, technically has then undermined their policy and they could be sacked as a result of that. However, if this place has a no restraint policy and they just let these two people fight because the staff are going, well, our policy says we're not allowed to stop them, well then straight away has the environment fulfilled its duty of care to protect the well-being of the individuals in the setting? So under health and safety law, not met its requirements. Duty of care and the Care Act has not met its requirements. So we have to be very mindful that there is a threshold here, that saying a no restraint policy, I completely understand that restraint should only be ever used as a last resort when no other option is available. Fine. If it could be within a workplace going, look, we've got very low risk of violence here and therefore we don't want to train our staff and therefore we would always tell them to withdraw or move away. We just have to be mindful that we're still meeting our duty of care as far as the well-being of the individual in the setting. Same as there was a situation with a 97-year-old man who unfortunately got killed within the care home setting and the staff didn't do anything about it. This individual was killed by another resident of this particular home, and the home got prosecuted because they had not fulfilled their duty of care. But what were the staff meant to do if they've never been trained in how to intervene or how to break away or how to restrain? Then how could they fulfill that duty of care? Police are better trained to apply physical intervention than care staff. So I've trained with quite a lot of police officers. I've done martial arts for many years of my life, and I've trained with a few cops. One of the things that I hear from them is they are trained in things like handcuff administration and use of batons and tasers and stuff like that. But the level of actually day-to-day physical intervention training is actually relatively poor. They don't go into as much as you would think they do. In fact, there's many care settings where their training is better than the training that police do. Yet there is this expectation that, well, we should just call the police. This is an incident. Well, is that the safest way of keeping the service users or the individuals within that setting safe? Also, if we had an incident, how long is it going to take the police to get there? Now, I completely understand there's certain thresholds as far as risk is concerned, that if we're dealing with somebody who's, let's say, armed or got a sharp weapon or anything like that, the staff probably shouldn't be going in and trying to wrestle it off them because they're not trained, they don't have the appropriate PPE, they don't have safety equipment, whatever it is. So it may be that we need to call the higher level of training or a higher level of risk management. But one of the principles is that we should only rely on police as a last resort, again, when it's appropriate to the circumstances. So if violence or unpredictable hazardous behaviour is something that's happening on a regular basis, and constantly the care setting is then calling the police to deal with it, they're not fulfilling their duty of care again, neither to their staff nor to the people within the environment. Again, so maybe the physical intervention, or the big thing, big appropriate positive behaviour support and de-escalation obviously should be in place. But again, if things are sometimes still failing as a result of that, then are they being trained properly in how to keep themselves safe or keep others safe in the environment? Having to restrain indicates failure on the side of the setting. So, as far as this one's concerned, as we've already said, and I kind of not going to linger the point too much, restraint is an absolute last resort. That doesn't mean that in circumstances where restraint is required, the setting has failed. I use the analogy of like a fire safety. The idea would be we put loads of preventative measures to prevent a fire from occurring. We also have proactive measures as far as certain situations that fire could occur, like cooking or any hot works or anything like that, where appropriate risk assessments are done to still reduce the risk to a reasonable level. But then fires can still occur. That's why we have fire extinguishers and smoke detectors and stuff. Now, why might that be? The idea would be if a risk assessment is done appropriately, then that should never happen. Absolutely. Okay. But what about certain situations that are unforeseeable? We can't then go, well, you should have known better, so you've then failed at having to use restraint. Sometimes, especially in the early stages where we've never experienced this before, if you get a new person coming into a setting, they may on paper look a certain way, and when they come into the setting, they behave very, very differently. And suddenly the setting is having to react to their behavior initially before they can start putting the plans in place and the proactive preventive strategies so they can respond rather than react in the future. As long as they're working in that direction, that if an incident occurs, okay, what can we put in place to never let that happen again? Or if that did happen again, could we have managed it in a more appropriate and safer way? As long as they're constantly looking to make physical intervention the last resort rather than the first resort, then that is not failure. They're still working forwards in the right direction. And condemning and judging a situation or any intervention from one incident, I think, is a dangerous thing to do. We also have to understand the nature of human behaviour, that, okay, yes, may or may not have been appropriate, or maybe we can learn from that, but mistakes are stepping stones to learning. That doesn't mean, obviously, if somebody is seriously injured or killed as a result of restraint, then something has gone very wrong. But as far as having to use restraint, again, constantly looking to try and improve practice and reduce it and prevent restraint completely. But it doesn't mean the place has failed. It may mean this is a new situation we've never come across before. We reacted, and therefore we then need to respond next time. Okay, last one then. Last little factor, true or false. The use of pain is illegal and should never be used. Also, single person restraints. Okay, so just to finish it off then, a little bit on these two. The use of pain compliance, where we are applying some level of pressure to control a person's movement and behaviour, is not technically illegal if it is justified under reasonable force. If it is not justified under reasonable force, then it may fall into the threshold of deprivation of human rights as far as torturous or or, 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 if I, let's say, have somebody coming up with a knife and I have to use pain to disarm that person with that knife, then, well, my right to life, so Article 2 of the Human Rights, actually takes precedent over, and therefore I should be able to justify my actions of using some level of pain. So aiming to use pain or misusing pain to control a person's movement behaviour, I completely agree with, should be avoided at all costs. But there is certain understanding and evidence that if duration is one of the factors that increases the risk of injury and harm the most, and we can control the risk the quickest way possible, and that may involve the use of pain, there could be a justification that pain is a safer way of doing it. Now, I'm not definitely advocating that. The juries are still out. It is a case of, is it right, is it wrong? But I think it's important to keep the argument open rather than going, "Ooh, hurting anybody is always wrong." No, not necessarily. We have to look at this within a kind of a contextual situation rather than just going, no, it's always wrong to do something. I think we have to explore the nuances of something around this area. So although we don't use any pain within our techniques because of the settings we tend to teach in, there is environments and situations and settings where, as long as pain is used as a last resort and it's the shortest time possible, it may be a safer option than other variations or other non-pain compliance techniques. Okay. Now, the single person restraint one, again, we as ABLE training, we do not advocate the use of single person holds. We do have them in our system, we do teach them with the preface that you must be working off a dynamic risk assessment and should only be used as a last resort. Again, the danger of using saying no single person restraints went to a place where they said they have a policy of no single person holds should be done. But then I sort of said, okay, so how many people have you, or service users you got in the setting? And they said it's 4. And how many staff members? They have 2. Okay, so what if you've got 2 people who are trying to fight each other, but you're not allowing use single person restraints? So what are you going to do? What if you've got 1 member of staff in a room and this person's trying to jump out the window? Or what about if we're going out into public and they go to go stepping into the road or anything like that? Wouldn't that be a single person restraint? And therefore, can't you be sacked because you've done single person restraint and your policy says no? Now, remember, policy is not the same as law. A workplace policy saying you shouldn't do something means that they can sack you based on their values. Okay, that's still different from either the court of law or from a safeguarding inquest. Okay, but if they're saying single person restraint, so my thing for this particular organisation would be single person restraint should only be ever used as an absolute last resort when no other option available, and only used for the shortest time possible until further assistance can be acquired. Okay, and I think that's a more appropriate definition of if I can hold and stop you jumping out the window and then release, fine. If I have to hold for a moment to allow a colleague to come in and assist, fine. But if I can avoid doing that, either I don't restrain at all, or I only do 2-person restraints to reduce the risk of force required to control the risk, but also as far as the vulnerability for myself, as far as things like allegations and all sorts of problems associated with that single person hold. So it isn't a case of single person hold should never be used, but again, it must be justifiable, reasonable use of force. And again, I would say that we should avoid it where possible. If there's and this is where organisations should be, again, looking at their risk assessment. If we've got an individual who is a high risk of unpredictable or aggressive behaviour, depending on their size, build, strength, core strength, those kind of factors, well, should they only have 1 member of staff available to support them if that is the case? Or should we have a higher staff ratio? So these are things to consider, so not black and white situations. Okay. So we reached the end of the session. I hope you found the information that I've gone through over this session useful, interesting. Obviously, this is a very small snippet of bits of information that we've kind of recognised as being a challenge for many settings. There's a lot more information. This obviously is days and days worth of content if need be. But by all means, send us a message, contact us, or even book a training session if that's something of interest that you feel that your organisation would like to know more about physical intervention, about the use of force, and about other means as far as what can we do to avoid these strategies. Thank you very much.